Hey everyone, it's LS, and this is going to be another LS Logic video, and the topic for today's video is actually going to be about pro teams and their stagnation. If you're unfamiliar with who I am, I'm one of the color casters for the LCK broadcast here in Korea. In addition to that, I was formerly an EU and NA LCS coach, and I also have experience actually coaching some Korean teams, which occurred last year, just in the Challenger Series of Korea. And on top of that, I was actually with Samsung White and Blue, up until when they became actually Samsung White and Blue, when they were MVP. And so I was a part of all of that. I'm also a coach publicly on YouTube, and I basically live for the analysis side of League and the really nitty-gritty micro and macro. So what I want to talk about today is actually the opinion that I had last year at Worlds, but I didn't actually get around to making a video for it, which was that pros weren't really getting better. And what I mean by that is that if you actually watch pro play and you look at all the major regions, so LPL, LCK, NA, and EU, you'll notice a particular trend that is beginning to occur, and I would say that it's been occurring ever since around Season 5, where professional teams go through these phases of having very bizarre macro and even very bizarre micro. And what ends up happening is that you have teams that are very good on specific patches, and then you have patches come out that end up destroying certain teams. One of the things, though, that has constantly seemed to remain true is that every single year, Korea tends to get slightly better in a macro sense. And I'm not just talking about their top teams, I'm talking about also their middle tier teams, and even their bottom tier teams that are completely new in creation. Meanwhile, when you look at NA and EU, you've had former titans such as Fnatic and Origin go through slumps and go through phases where they constantly go up and down. Even most notably, H2K was a victim of this briefly. And then you look at NA and you have a team like CLG that becomes increasingly more difficult to actually predict what they're going to be able to do given a various split or how long a split ends up going on. We've also seen this occur with Team Liquid, and we've even seen it occur with TSM, but to a lesser degree. And I'm going to get into that. So one of the things I want to talk about is that Spring Split is underway, and we've already seen in the LCK that SK Telecom is looking untouchable. And then we're also seeing that Samsung Galaxy, the runner-up for the World Cup, who then proceeded to actually bomb out of the Kespa Cup, and even the Kespa Cup showed some new faces like Hongdu Monsters, who looked extremely vulnerable actually in Challenger Series Korea, suddenly showing this insane level of macro, and they ended up actually making it to the finals of the Kespa Cup, only to lose to the hands of the Rox Tigers, who many thought actually could have potentially just won the World Cup in 2016. And they actually lost to SK Telecom 2-3 in the semifinals, and it's actually the iconic Nidalee game where it was more so Peanut just playing really bad and SK Telecom managing to pick Nidalee on Bengi, and Bengi coming in and saving the series. The thing, though, is that if you take a look at the macro game, going back from Season 5 to current, Season 7, you'll notice something between NA and EU where oftentimes they actually end up having very bad spring splits. And then they suddenly have very good to moderately better summer splits leading directly up into Worlds. When you look at Korea and when you look at China, what ends up happening is that spring split in Korea generally tends to be pretty okay. And then in summer split, middle of the pack teams end up finding ways to contend against the top tier teams and the big dogs of the league, which is actually how Samsung Galaxy, who was a 4th, 5th basically placing team in LCK Summer, found a way via the gauntlet to change up their playstyle, and they managed to actually topple KT and make it into the World Championships, which ended up producing the meme, KT died for this. Even though Samsung Galaxy went on to have an extremely good performance at the World Cup, and they actually made a run to the finals where they lost to SK Telecom. I'm going to talk about that more in depth because of the way that Samsung Galaxy made it to the finals and how they actually tended to play, but also looking at their games against Western teams. So something that is becoming more increasingly obvious to me is that when you watch Western teams, most notably it's actually happening in this split, you can see how teams like TSM, who I was even of the opinion that if you gave the World Cup TSM roster like 6 more months, and if you gave them 6 more months of proper training, proper SoloQ training, and if hypothetically they could come to Korea, train in Korea, play against Korean teams, etc., I actually thought that TSM, with that roster, including maybe one change, whether it come to the top lane or it come to the support lane. I know that a lot of Koreans were of the opinion that the problem was more centered in the support rather than up and top via Hauntzer, because Hauntzer actually fills a role that TSM needs, although in North America, Hauntzer is able to take on an additional role that he is not able to actually take on internationally, which is a carry role and being actually one of the best Western top laners. So in that regard, what ends up happening is when you watch TSM, Cloud9, CLG, etc. play in North America, and I watched basically the later part of the NA LCS summer split, and I continued to watch the Gauntlet. And one of the things that was very apparent to me was that the teams didn't actually understand macro, but what ended up occurring was they would secure very large advantages, and the other team's inability to understand macro and play from behind and play without advantages or playing without leads would lead to teams apparently having relatively strong macro. And what I mean by that was, if you really broke down at the minor level, some of the decision makings that these teams were making, you could see very big flaws in their decision making. You could see very big errors. But they would go unpunished because the opposing team would be incapable of punishing for such macro errors. And so then it really begged the question of, did these teams really understand macro, or were they so good on a micro and mechanical level that they didn't need to be good at macro because the other team wasn't actually that good at macro? And so what would end up happening was TSM would have these games where they would just roll over their opposition. Another way that they would roll over their opposition was most notably Bjergsen on wave clear mid laners. And this is something that I think at the World Cup on the analyst desk that we got to actually talk about, most notably in TSM's Group D, and how they chose to play out their lanes, where if Bjergsen wasn't on a wave clear mid and he was unable to roam to actually assist his side lanes, it ended up proving a very difficult time for TSM to actually find ways to secure advantages and then come back. And then there was even some very elementary macro errors that were being made by TSM. And then if we look at the way that Samsung Galaxy also played in the World Cup against teams like TSM and against most notably H2K, and then we also look at how H2K played in the World Cup, they were very win lane, win game type focused because their macro would end up falling apart on top of itself. So when we enter into the off season and the World Cup concludes, what ends up happening is there's a lot of roster changes. And because the coaching and infrastructure in the West is significantly weaker than it is in the East, what ends up occurring is that analysts, coaches, players, and everything gets shuffled up. And when that type of stuff gets shuffled up, then you bring in new players that now have to relearn the macro components of the game, and they have to relearn how certain things are going to be coordinated in a macro sense. What this ends up leading to is the examples of things that we're actually beginning to see in NA and EU Spring Split, where you have teams like TSM, with only having changed their AD carry, beginning to make very, very big macro blunders. And you have teams like CLG that haven't changed their roster in an extremely long time, again, making extremely big macro blunders. And then the question that you have to propose is why? Why are these teams that have stuck together for so long making such elementary macro decisions? Why are they not able to understand the game at a core level? And that's exactly the problem, is that they're not understanding the game at the core level. And when you factor in the suboptimal practice that the NA and European SoloQ ends up providing for these players, it makes it even more increasingly difficult to properly practice and properly gain the knowledge that is necessary to understand the game at its core level. So then what ends up occurring is that NA and EU begin to get fascinated by the minutia of the game in terms of strategy. And so you end up having these very weird pick and ban phases. You have these weird picks that come out. You have very polarizing team compositions and players occur inside of the region. So moving forward from that, you end up watching, week one of NA and EU LCS. You watch how the games are developing, how they're progressing, and you see very bizarre teleport plays. You see an inability to properly make Baron calls. You're seeing mistakes like players funneling into Baron River or Dragon River, and then being forced to concede mid-tier 1 turret, even though that's a macro rotation that has been pretty obvious since even going back into Season 4 or Season 5. And I'm not saying that Korean teams are somehow not doing these things, because they are. Koreans aren't necessarily these super gods and stuff, but they're doing it to less frequency. And the manner in which they're losing games because of decisions like this are less severe. And the reason that it's less severe is because one of the things that Korea focuses on is the infrastructure and the coaching and truly understanding the game on a deeper level. Something that I actually recently said to a group of pro players recently when I was talking about NA and EU is the ability for Korean pros and even Chinese pros to a certain degree, not all of them, but a pretty large majority, can actually play off lanes at an equally high level. Not necessarily a professional level, but they can still play it at an extremely high level. And what I mean by this is if you look up some of the LCK pros inside of SoloQ and you look up some of their alt IDs, because sometimes they have many, you'll notice that they are extremely adept at actually playing alternate lanes. The same can't really be said for NA or European pros. And then on top of that, sometimes you have interviews and stories come out where NA and EU pros are slower to pick up some of the meta or more complex champions that fit into complex team compositions. So what ends up occurring is because NA and EU is so driven by sponsorship and wins and fan base and media attention, etc., that they end up focusing significantly on the strategy aspect of the game. They look on securing advantages and leads and ways that they can get edges over their opponents. And so a lot of their focus and training is more so focused on the opposition rather than internally. And so when you're not focusing internally on getting better, and when you're not focusing internally on understanding the game more, then you end up being forced to keep up with the patches and you end up being forced to keep up with the meta. And then by nature, because you're forcing yourself to keep up with these two things, you're also forcing yourself to keep up with how are other teams adapting to it. And this goes back to what I talked about earlier about how NA and EU has very bizarre spring splits, and then they tend to have significantly stronger summer splits once the teams, the coaching staffs, and everything begin to get more tied down and they begin to get more into the groove of what they're doing. Now, the reason that I want to tie this back into Korea is if we're looking at Longzhu Gaming, or you're looking at Samsung Galaxy, or you're looking at the new ROX Tigers, which is basically the old Afrika, except with the addition of the subs, one of the things that you'll notice is that Samsung Galaxy, who was known for not really having superb macro play, but their late game was actually the best aspect of their game. And if you look at how they actually played against Western teams at Worlds, most notably H2K, the first game actually comes to mind, where Jankos had arguably the best performance of a jungler for the first 20-25 minutes of the game on his Olaf. And even with that, they were unable to actually find a way to break in and penetrate Samsung Galaxy's defense, and then eventually the game stalled out and Samsung was able to overthrow the Western team due to an inability to understand the 35-45 minute game. And this is something that I've always talked about as a coach because of my philosophy on working backwards to forward rather than forward to backward. Because patches are always going to change, but the core understanding of the game, the core rotations, the core map movements, the core code of the game, so to say, movement speeds, damage, neutral objectives, the fact that the towers are always going to stay in the same place, etc. Now, obviously, patches can end up occurring, which changes the base armor or the lane swap kill, how lane swaps ended up getting killed. That stuff does end up happening, and then what ends up occurring is teams begin to fluctuate in terms of how good they are and trying to stabilize inside of the patch. One of the things that Korea and also even China to some degree has been extremely good at is being able to stabilize quicker and being able to refine quicker. And this ties into the fact that the players have a more baseline understanding of the game itself and not realistically just the patch and everything pertaining to the patch. So now you're looking at NA LCS, and most notably, one of the teams that is actually doing relatively well is FlyQuest. And if you look at how they're doing relatively well, it's because a lot of people are attributing it to Hai. And Hai is someone that has always been proclaimed as being one of the best shot callers in the West and someone that understands the game. Now, Hai is not a mechanical beast. He is not someone that, tears people down through mechanics and forcing outplays and, punishing mistakes and stuff. That's not how he approaches the game. He approaches the game from the understanding of the baseline level, and that's always why Hai has actually been so valuable to so many teams, is because of his baseline understanding of the game. And so because of that, he becomes an extremely valuable asset, and he becomes almost in a way priceless to a lot of the teams that end up having him and picking him up. And because he's one of the few players in the West that is able to do that and understand the game at a a baseline level, he ends up enabling teams that do have him. And it just ends up producing good synergy, and then he's able to move around to different roles and lanes. And this is something that is also seemingly unheard of in the West, although it has happened a few times in Korea. Most notably, you can talk about Ambition, a player that fluctuated around different roles, but you can also look at some of the other players that they're extremely adept at alternate roles inside of SoloQ. And even sometimes pros will actually end up talking about a pro player's ability to play an off role at an extremely high level. So now we go into and we basically assess Korea in a way, where Longzhu Gaming is a team that has been able to show significant improvement in a way, in a macro sense, and they've even managed to pull off some complex team compositions, although now they have a little bit of a different coaching staff and a coaching roster. But in the same sense, they then begin to fall apart at the later stages of the macro. And you must have to attribute that to the fact that they are so hard stuck on trying to keep up with the other teams, because Longzhu is a roster that, specifically in LCK Summer, they had some of the worst macro I've ever seen from a Korean team. And it's not necessarily worse than CJ Entus was, but it was quite bad. And if you looked at the way that Longzhu would actually win games in LCK Summer, it would be very similar to how a Western team would win games, which was they would win lane, they would secure advantages, and they would ride the advantages out while not really having the best macro. So far in LCK Spring 2017, they've had a little bit better macro, but you can still see some of the weaknesses. And some of the weaknesses is probably because they spent so much time and effort on improving their early mid game and making sure that their early and mid was much more fluid, that now their end game is actually compromised. Not that it wasn't compromised before. But one of my predictions for Longzhu is that towards the end of Spring Split and heading into summer, they're actually going to become a pretty formidable opponent for some of the top level teams. And so that's something that I'm looking forward to. And I think that that's because eventually they'll be able to step away from hyper-focusing on the early and mid-game, because if you look at how they actually coordinate in the early and mid-game, they don't actually do anything that's necessarily flashy. They're starting to actually come together on a core fundamental level and just interact with their champions and their picks and their team compositions. Then when you go over to SK Telecom and you look at how they're actually coordinating and winning their games, one of the things that's most notable about SK Telecom is how fast everything goes from 0 to 100, basically in the snap of a finger. There have been games where teams have kept up with SK Telecom pretty even in gold to 10-15 minutes, and then all of a sudden the opponents make one mistake and it's all over, it's lights out. And even the Rocks Tigers of LCK 2016, while they were a little bit more forceful in how they caused opponents to make mistakes, and their aggression was arguably unrivaled in a lot of ways, they were not as decisive and as punishing as the current rendition of SK Telecom is in Spring 2017 LCK. And so if you haven't watched any of those games, I would highly recommend that you go over and do it. KT, if you look at how KT's playing their games, they have a lot more strength in the late game, and you could actually attribute this to the veteranship of most of their players. But then in addition to that, who their players actually are, most notably they do have Mata, who is considered, if not the best support player in the world, leading their team, and he is one of the best shot callers of all time. He was a part of Samsung White. And so moving from that, it's going to be a question of, can KT actually manage to keep up with SK Telecom? And we're actually going to find out in March. I believe that the date is March 2nd when they do collide. And so KT is going to have a little bit more time to get into the groove of things, get into the rhythm. And I'm not sure what exactly patch will be taking place right now, but between now and 7.3, the meta is going to stagnate. And so right now we're seeing basically the most common thing, which has Rengar, LeBlanc, and Camille being banned by the red team, and then the blue team basically dictating the pace of the initial draft phase. And the meta is basically figured out, even though the diversity right now is arguably one of the highest that we've ever had in professional, competitive play. And I think that that's really pretty, and I think that that's actually really beautiful because we're able to have such diversity in a sense that, B tiers and C tiers are actually being enabled via the 10 ban system. Although to which degree that they're useful becomes heavily reliant on team color and team composition, and obviously the draft order. Then going even further, actually, I just mentioned something about team color. We begin to talk about team color because this is something that I think that all teams, including even Korea, neglected during season 4, 5, and 6. Now, notably, there were some instances of players talking about this, even in interviews and stuff, like certain color aspects of the game. For instance, one of the things that comes to mind was Deft. Deft would almost refuse to play Jin on blue side in SoloQ. And he also apparently did not like to ever play Jin, even if he was on blue side, and that was primarily because of the way that golems interacted in bottom lane. It was more difficult for Jin to actually eat the golems because of his 4-hit passive, made it more awkward than if he was red side, because then he could get the Gromp. And super micro aspects like this end up becoming more and more important, and at pro play, that can, obviously shift the balance considerably. So now, when we talk about this and we talk about colors, we're starting to actually see that, hey, certain champions do different things on different colors. Because of the RNG of dragons, and because players are beginning to understand more and more what certain dragons do against certain team compositions and what it means to intentionally leave certain dragons up so that it delays stuff for your opponents, because you realize that it benefits us less than it benefits them, but then in the same sense, it doesn't benefit them a lot at all. So if we make them waste time in getting it, then we can use that as an opportunity to capture some sort of vision control. And these type of macro thought processes are going to be the thought processes that help enable and propel teams into, obviously, a higher level of gameplay. But what ends up happening now is the question becomes do they think about the thought process because of a core fundamental of the game? Do they think about it as a core thought process that applies to MOBAs, or are they seeing it more so as a patch? Because one would suggest that they're seeing it more so because of a patch, and that goes back to the thing that I talked about off-season. And this is, again, going full circle, most obvious about, again, the coaching staffs in Korea compared to the coaching staffs in NA and EU. Because teams actually have analysts and coaches that the public don't know about. And those analysts and coaches do get cycled around almost religiously in a way. And so you'll end up, encountering people that say that, I was an analyst for so-and-so, or I was a coach for so-and-so. And even if they're not on the official staff, they're still there in some sense. They're still there for scrim blocks, or they're still there in a freelance sense, or they're there on trial, and you never get to hear about them. And these people end up getting cycled over and over and over. And what ends up happening is these analysts and coaches, they become so concerned with their ability to keep up with the meta so that they're able to maintain their job and keep everyone happy, etc., that they're not really taking the time to understand the core of the game, how a MOBA interacts, how it functions, and some of the baseline rules, basically, or laws that you should tend to follow if you want to find yourself successful and not falling to certain metas. And speaking of certain metas, this is also why there are certain players that seemingly are able to just live through continuous amounts of metas, and they seem to never get affected by certain metas. Whereas you have players go from star players to mediocre players, and sometimes even extremely bad players. One of the biggest instances that I personally got to witness and I was personally a part of was back when I was on SHC in 2014, which later became MYM. We had a top laner whose name was Mimer, or Memer, or however you want to pronounce it. And what would happen is in the tank meta of, Trundle, Shyvana, Renekton, Darius, etc., he was one of the best players. He was very good at extended trades and calculating, the trades and the differences and the damage foresight over, 10 to 20 seconds. And then when the meta shifted into more of a knife fight and stuff, he began to fall off and have difficulty with that, and he couldn't actually keep up with it. And because he was so set in his way of playing a slow and methodical style of the lane that was not actually applicable to the way that the game interacts when different variables are entertained, it ended up making him just fall out of the limelight, and then eventually he actually went on to quit, and I think he wanted to go into coaching, and then the last I heard that he wanted to come back as a support player. And so now, going full circle for this, we can also talk about SoloQ, because the SoloQ is something that also ties into it. If you watch NA and EU SoloQ, it's an inadequate and it's a suboptimal place to practice, and that's because if you look at some of the higher MMR games, not only is the system sometimes broken, where the matchmaking is regularly unfair, But you also get people that don't take the game too serious, and you get a lot of people that are not necessarily involved in the pro scene or even the Challenger Series scene. So you end up having these instances occur where things become more of a clown fiesta than proper tactical macro play. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you open up an LCK, or a Korean high challenger, high master tier solo queue game, you'll actually see a lot of players that are either on LSPL, LPL, Challenger Korea, or LCK. Whereas if you open up an NA or EU solo queue game, you can get either a bunch of randoms, you can get some, players that are playing in wildcard regions, like they're playing either in Turkey, or they're playing in Latin America, or they're playing in LAS, Brazil, EU Nordic East, etc. And what ends up happening is all these different types of styles and personalities and cultural differences end up occurring. And not only is there toxicity that ends up finding its way into the game, but you also have these people that find their way into the game and they maintain their MMR through different means than actually being good at the game. And that might sound really weird, but it's because that they've developed methods of maintaining a certain amount of MMR, even though they can go on a roller coaster up and down constantly. And because of that, the pros end up suffering. And the pros don't just suffer because of the ping, because it is very different to go from 60 or 70 ping to playing on 8 ping. There's just certain things that you actually can't end up doing. And it becomes even more increasingly difficult to properly practice and train. And what this ends up doing is it hurts NA and EU for international competitions where everyone's going to be on an even ping setting. And it ends up playing even more into the hands of Korea and China, where even the Chinese players are able to play on Korea with 30 ping usually at the highest. If they're living pretty deep into the mainland of China, then sometimes the ping can actually go up to 60 or even 70, which was one of Apto's meme names. He said, I think his ID or something was beating you on 70 ping LOL, or something to that nature, or 70 ping LOL, because you shouldn't be able to win certain matchups in that ping. And so then what ends up occurring is these players end up getting sucked in and they get engulfed to the negativeness of the solo queue. And so then they become more concerned with experimentation and practicing certain picks, etc., while not really getting the best of practice. And so then it becomes increasingly more reliant on scrims, but then when you factor in League of Cards aspects, you have stuff end up getting leaked and coming out that certain teams aren't scrimming other teams, and you have a secretive nature end up coming out, and people are concealing picks, they're not talking about strategy. And one of the things that always confused me and it always surprised me was NA and EU lack social networks for helping each other get better. Whereas in Korea and China, and I've talked about this a lot in the past, the players are a lot more open with each other, even players from other teams. And what it'll end up doing is it provides this network for people to constantly talk about the game with each other, and they're constantly helping each other get better. Now, obviously, leading up to major matches, they're not going to help each other, and we've seen Korea and China do this in other games. We've seen it in Dota, we've seen it in Starcraft 1, and we've seen it in Starcraft 2, where teammates from opposing teams will help out anyone that they can, unless it means that they're going to meet them in a week or two, in which case they would take a temporary break from helping them and practicing with them. And that way they can fine-tune stuff to coming up with strategies that will help players beat them. One of the other things I guess that I could bring up as an example for this, or I can talk about this, is how NA and EU, sometimes when new major patches end up coming out, certain teams look phenomenal. And I would compare this to the early release of Starcraft 2, or basically any new game, where certain players thrive inside of the chaos. And I think this is something that Thorin actually did a Thorin's Thoughts on. I don't know what episode, but I do recall him talking about this, and I recall him actually specifically mentioning TLO, I believe. So TLO is on Team Liquid's actual Starcraft 2 team, and he is a player that early on into the life of Starcraft 2, he was constantly a B- through B+ tier player in Starcraft 1. His name was IPS Radio on IC Cup, so we're going back into 2008, 2009, and he wasn't good at the game. And because StarCraft 1 was very mechanical. It required you to have a very strong control over the mechanics of the game and the core fundamentals of the game. And it was less so about strategy than it was just about being able to outmuscle your opponent. And so TLO, whose approach and his style and his philosophy for the game was more so tailored to getting edges and outsmarting his opponent and surprising them, didn't find success in that game. He was constantly just in the B ranks. And IC Cup, once you got to A-, it then became every 1,500 points. You would go up to A, and then A+, and then there was Olympic rings. And there was only ever, there was only ever 3 Western players to ever hit A+, and there was only, I think, 2 Western players that ever hit Olympic rings on IC Cup, and that was Greg Idra Fields and Sherwin Yosh Mabad. And Yosh is actually someone that I talk about a lot because he was my former coach, and he was my former mentor. And if you look at some of the best Western players of all time going back into StarCraft 1, you would see how the ones that did remain on top and the ones that didn't really ever fluctuate, such as Idra, such as Mondragon, such as Testy, White Raw, etc., is because they could take extremely long breaks from the game, come back, and in a week or two, they would be back on top, and it's because they understood the game on a core level. And the way that I want to tie this into StarCraft 2 is because in the beginning, when no one knew any builds, when no one knew anything, and strategy was basically up in the air, and it was impossible to have the ability to just outmuscle your opponent mechanically, you had a lot of Western players complete with the Koreans. And in League of Legends now, you end up having this occur as well, where if major patches come out that completely shake up the meta, you have certain teams that are much more adept at figuring out the chaos, and they figure out how to solve that meta, so to speak. And if they can do it before their opponents, then they end up finding temporary success until everyone catches up. And then once everyone catches up, you end up having the problem that, are they actually good at the game? In which case the answer would be no. And if anyone would want to see examples of that, you can look back at EU and NA towards the end of the summer weeks and even the gauntlet, where the players actually weren't that good at macro. There was very big elementary mistakes being made from the top teams, but it was being masked by an opponent's inability to react to it properly. So for instance, if TSM, if we were to compare this to chess, if TSM is so much better than their opponents, then obviously they can move their rook pawn as the first move of the game. Now, we know that at the higher levels of chess, this would be a very bad move. It's a very big mistake, and you could put it into a chess computer and it would explain, or it would be able to show why it's a very bad mistake. But if TSM does this and an opponent can't react to it in a way that would punish it, then you would end up being convinced that it's okay and that it's an all right move, even though you can break it down frame by frame inside of a pause and explain why it's not a very good macro rotation. So to conclude this video, all that I basically want to say is that pros' skill levels and their mechanics aren't really improving, and it's beginning to stagnate in the West. And that's why you have star players that are able to sometimes stay on top for extended periods of time until the meta ends up shifting. Although in recent times, we have had some players begin to pop up from NA and EU that are proving to be extremely mechanically good, and they have a lot of potential. Although sometimes their potential needs to be focused in a certain direction in order to see the proper use of it. And some of those players are like Dardoch, who is one of the best NA players that has come out of the NA region recently. And you have Moon, Moon, who a lot of people criticized heavily, even though I've always been someone that spoke pretty highly of him. And I said that I felt like he was mismanaged and misused, and not misused, but the way that he was being used on NRG and even Team Liquid was incorrect. And that ties back into how teams focus on certain aspects of the game. And then you have European players that are popping up like Alfari and Caps, and some other players, and it just basically ties into these players are more hungry, and because they're not concerned with the SoloQ rating and experimentation, etc., they're getting a lot better at the core fundamentals of the game, and that's what's enabling them to stand out, whereas other players have begun trying to keep up and remain relevant and try to just blitz out their opponents and stay ahead. And so I think that that's pretty much it for this. And that's all that I really wanted to talk about. But I think that the big problem that NA and EU is going to face is if they don't truly start breaking down the game on a core level, then we're going to basically continuously see the same cycle where although some players will rise up and they'll add new mechanical challenges and they'll force other players to basically wake up a little bit and improve slightly, the speed at which it's going to improve is not going to be very much, and pro play as a whole is going to stagnate. And that's pretty much it. And yeah, all right, so hope that you enjoyed the video, and let me know what you think in the comments below. And that's it. Bye.